Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and every time I make a training clip of me doing training with certain exercises, people will invariably chime in with, oh, you need to control the weight on the way down. You need to focus on the eccentrics, and it's hilarious when they say that because it's, again, people not really understanding training or the body's training response, like the body's adaptation to training response. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing. Let's do a little bit of crafting and let's talk about it. And I only use myself as an example there because it gets brought up from my training. I don't want everyone to think that I consider myself the pinnacle of size and strength by any means. I'm a middle-aged guy about to turn 40. I don't use enormous amounts of gear. Let's be honest, I'm never going to be the pinnacle of size and strength and everything else. But I do know how to train, and I know a lot about training and exercise science. So the problem with this is that people have this idea that eccentric reps are actually essential to gaining massive amounts of size and strength. The reality is progressive overload is the only thing that's essential. All right, guys, that and recovery and food. Those are the only things that are essential. Now, in fact, once drugs come into the mix, even some of that becomes not essential. But, assuming people aren't on a hefty amount of drugs, progressive overload, that's what's essential. And what I mean is, we've had studies done over the years, for many years. People started studying this stuff decades ago, showing that when we have people do only concentric reps, and people who don't know what concentric means, that's the lifting of the weight. Eccentric rep is lowering of the weight. And we have people do eccentric only training for months, like actually using machines to help them do the other end, like forklift-like machines, so that they can just do concentric reps and then have the weight be lowered by a machine, or they can have a weight lift the machine and then release the weight so they can just do the lowering. And what they have found is that both produce muscle growth. In fact, if workload and volume gets high enough, both can produce maximum levels of muscle growth. That's the thing. What people need to understand, they're always like, no, you need to do this, you need to do this. No, you don't need to do anything other than have progressive overload. There are benefits to doing different things, but you don't need to do those things. And again, we've had studies over the years show that it's possible, again, if workload's high enough, to do exclusively lifting or lowering the weights and still gain very large amounts of muscle mass. I mean, what more do people need to understand that? Each one are just useful tools. Now, for most people, it would be sometimes silly to completely skip one or the other because it would be unorthodox. But what if you have actual reasons to do so? Such as when I do them, for example, on deadlifts and pin leg rows. And you guys have seen my back. It's not like I don't have a tremendous amount of back development. You guys can think about whatever you want about the rest of my physique. And if you're going to argue that I don't have a massive amount of back development, we've got a problem. You're just delusional. So that being said, most of my back exercises, I skip the eccentric. Why? Because I'm focusing on a performance element. And in fact, that's the thing that people need to realize. You're always going to gain strength with size. You're always going to gain size with strength. But different performance elements can be focused upon more. If you want to be more explosive and lift a weight more explosively, if your work is centered around explosive work, you're going to grow based upon your progressive overload, but you're going to be more explosive if you train explosively. If you train explosive concentric reps, you're going to be better at being explosive. If you train doing slow negatives, you're going to be really good at being able to lower heavy weights slowly. You're going to be better at lowering heavy weights more slowly. Like if you had to pick up a car and lower it slowly, you're going to be better at that than a guy who turns loose of his deadlift at the top every time. If you actually do slow controlled negatives on your deadlifts, you're going to be better at lowering that car. Why? Because of performance carryover, specificity of training. Someone who trains exclusively and gets more explosive concentric reps in by skipping the eccentric is going to be more explosive on lifting a weight. Why? Because that's what he trains himself to do. Stop and think about that for a minute. It's just common sense when you think about it. You shouldn't even need a science book, but the science confirms this. You shouldn't need a science book to tell you that the things that you train at, you're going to get better at. Anything that you practice doing or you train doing, you're usually going to be better at that than if you don't do it. Common sense. You get good at anything you practice at. Every human being on earth knows this. No rocket science needed. But the science definitely confirms this. We call it specificity of training. It's called specific adaptation to imposed demands. So the science has studied what everyone already knows is common sense and confirmed that in this case, common sense is right. All right, so that being said, Glenn Pinley, big expert, Olympic lifting coach in the United States, pointed out that he has guys on bulking programs do exclusively concentric work. High volumes of concentric work, like 10 sets of 3 and everything, explosively fast with no negatives on tons of exercises. Why does he do that? This is what he does for bulking programs when he wants to bring guys up into the next weight class. People say, well, that's not an efficient way to gain weight. Sure it is. If you're eating enough calories and he's getting high progressive overload with high workload, they're going to gain maximum size. How could they not? Progressive overload is what determines your rate of growth. If they're progressing on all those explosive exercises and getting enough volume with them, they're going to grow as fast as humanly possible. They're going to reach maximum growth. The difference is they've gained all of their size while training in a way that's explosive. That's specific to his sport, Olympic lifting. If they got bigger and faster at the same time, they're not going to be better lifters. They're going to be faster and more explosive come competition. It's very simple. The other thing to consider there is that what we do know, eccentric reps, slow eccentric reps can reduce recovery time more so than concentric reps in some cases. They cause more micro-tearing. They don't cause more growth because of the more micro-tearing. Again, a point people need to remember there, but they can create more recovery inroads if you're not careful. Not always, but they can. In my case, things like deadlifts, Pinley rows, big lifts, why would I want to impede my recovery? The other thing to consider is that things like deadlifts, lowering the weight more slowly, has a higher chance of injury. Letting it fall fast actually has less chance of injuring your back. Almost no one ever hurts their back on a deadlift while lifting explosively with good form. It's usually the lowering in which they get injured. And as far as their back is concerned, either bouncing it off the floor and jerking it back up immediately or lowering it slow. That's how people generally get injured on the deadlift, 95% of the time. So again, lower injury rate and the fact that the deadlift is a tremendously taxing exercise. It will absolutely hammer your recovery ability. There's no need to add to it. At least in my opinion, I believe the deadlift should be performed without an eccentric rep. But most gyms won't let you turn loose of the weight at the top. And if you're training for powerlifting competition, you have to train yourself to be able to hold it, to lower it under some control. The amount I do in videos is enough to pass a powerlifting meet, by the way. They consider that controlled. So you've got that issue to consider, lower injury rate, better recovery, and then you can focus on what you're trying to do. Lift the weight explosively, powerfully. It's not that one has more size advantage than the other. They're just different training elements, different components. Now, someone could argue they could get out of the gym a little faster by doing eccentric reps because they could do less total reps and get there, but not really, because you're adding more time to the set anyways. It doesn't actually work that way. So that argument is kind of a moot point in my opinion, but it's one I've heard made. Sounds reasonable, but not true. Now, the reality is there are tons of exercises that you have to do an eccentric to do safely. Deadlifts, Pinley rows obviously are not on there, but you know, you try doing a dip or a bench press without an eccentric rep. Can't do it. No safe way to do it. So the difference is there are exercises in which it is not safe because lowering the weight too fast, the weight could hit you. It could pull a joint out, your shoulder joint, something. So I understand that some exercises you have to have some control on the eccentric to make them work, but it isn't necessary. And the truth is, even squats don't require a controlled eccentric. Look how many top Olympic lifters around the world never get hurt, are very muscular, very powerful, who just dive bomb their squats. If you watch a lot of them squat, they just drop almost at free fall speed and kind of catch it at the bottom. They don't really get hurt doing this. Why? Because they have good form, good technique, and they know what they're doing. So at the end of the day, guys, eccentric reps, there are exercises in which you have to do them, and there are cases where you might want to do an eccentric rep for some performance element. But this idea that you need slow, controlled eccentrics, that they're essential to gaining muscle mass quickly, isn't supported by the science. It isn't supported by the real-world observations of the top coaches around the world in top-level sports who do need to bulk their athletes up sometimes. And so it's just not grounded in reality. This is, again, bodybuilder nonsense that came out of earlier studies looking at it and noting the micro-tearing and everything. And the fact that, you know, again, generally, you can do less total reps if you do both the concentric and eccentric to get the same amount of growth. You end up having to do a little more work if you just do one or the other. So it's just oftentimes efficient to do so. It's not that it's essential, it's not necessary for growth, never has been. Again, too many athletes and coaches around the world have noted that, and people have noted that as long as the workload is high enough, it doesn't really matter whether it's eccentric or concentric reps that you're getting your stimulation from. It's all about workload as far as muscle growth is concerned. Where they play a role is the performance end. So that's ultimately the only thing that really matters there, is the performance end of it and what you're trying to do. In my case, I'm just not interested in doing many eccentric reps. It doesn't benefit me in any way other than on exercises in which I would get hurt by skipping them. Deadlifts and pin lay rows aren't on that list. Alright guys, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.